In the heart of ancient Egypt, where the Nile flowed like a ribbon of life and death, power was not just inherited, it was manufactured through bloodlines. The royal families of Egypt believed they were the earthly reflections of divine gods, descendants of Ra and Horus themselves. To them, marrying outside their family was not just socially unacceptable, it was blasphemy. The pharaoh, seen as a living god, could only unite with one of his own kind, which meant his sisters, daughters, or nieces. This belief gave rise to one of the most disturbing royal customs in history: incest in the name of divinity. It wasn't uncommon for pharaohs to take their sisters as wives. The logic was simple yet horrifying. If the gods married their own kin, then the rulers of Egypt should too. Osiris had married his sister Isis, and their union produced Horus, the divine child. Following this mythological blueprint, Egyptian royalty believed that keeping the bloodline pure would ensure their divine right to rule. But what they did not realize was that they were not preserving purity. They were planting seeds of genetic decay. Take the royal line of the Ptolemies, for example. The dynasty that gave birth to the famous Cleopatra was riddled with brother-sister marriages. Generation after generation, the same faces, the same genes, the same errors repeated themselves. The gods may have smiled upon them in marble and gold, but in the dark corners of the palace, their children were born deformed, weak, or sickly. Yet the priests called it divine mystery, not hereditary curse. Cleopatra herself, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was likely the product of multiple generations of incest. Her beauty was legendary, but so were her manipulative instincts and intense desire for control, traits some historians believe were the result of inbred psychology. The pharaohs were trapped in their own mythology, prisoners of a system they created to appear godlike. Inside the gilded walls of their palaces, family ties blurred beyond recognition. A man could be both father and uncle to his child, or husband and brother to his wife. Their family trees weren't trees at all. They were twisted vines, looping endlessly upon themselves. While the peasants worshipped them as semi-divine, few knew the darkness that brewed behind the golden masks. The practice of incest wasn't limited to rulers alone. It trickled down into noble families who sought to imitate the royal custom. Marrying a cousin or niece was seen as a mark of purity, a way to keep one's lineage close to the gods. But the result was often tragic. Mental illness, stillbirths, and physical deformities became hidden epidemics among the elite. Egyptian physicians, though skilled in medicine, couldn't cure the curse that came from their own arrogance. In the temples, priests would perform rituals to bless royal unions, singing hymns to the gods who had done the same in myth. They never questioned the morality of these acts. To them, it was sacred duty, not sin. The idea of romantic love didn't exist in these arrangements. Marriages were contracts of power. Pharaohs took multiple wives, but the great royal wife was often a sister. She symbolized the merging of divine masculine and feminine, a living representation of the gods' eternal unity. Yet behind this holy image lay human suffering. Many of these women were forced into unions they could not refuse. A princess could become a queen overnight, but also a prisoner in a gilded cage, sharing her bed with a brother she barely knew. Some bore children who wouldn't live to see their first year, victims of the bloodline's decay. And yet, the cycle continued. Each generation believed it was chosen by the gods, unaware that they were slowly destroying themselves. Even in death, the incestuous bonds were celebrated. Tomb inscriptions and murals depicted royal couples hand in hand, their love glorified as divine. Statues of pharaohs and their sisters stood together for eternity, their features identical, their eyes carved in perfect symmetry, an eerie reflection of the sameness that plagued their blood. The irony was cruel. The civilization that built wonders to defy time, that studied the stars and embalmed their dead with surgical precision, could not escape the blindness of their own traditions. They mastered death, but misunderstood life. Their obsession with divine purity ensured their mortal downfall. The pharaohs may have believed they were gods walking among men, but in truth, They were victims of their own myth, a dynasty bound by pride, power, and blood so closely intertwined that it turned sacred lineage into silent horror. In ancient Egypt, sex and spirituality were inseparable. The people of the Nile saw fertility as a sacred force, the very essence of creation that linked humans to their gods. But within this devotion lay a practice both revered and feared: sacred prostitution. Temples dedicated to deities of love and fertility, such as Hathor, the goddess of beauty, pleasure, and motherhood, and Min, the god of virility, became centers where faith and flesh intertwined in ways that would shock the modern world. For many women, serving in these temples was considered an honor. They were called the divine ones, or servants of the goddess. But behind the gold ornaments and perfumed incense, there was a darker truth. These women were not free. Their sacred service often meant surrendering their bodies to strangers under the guise of worship. Men would travel from distant villages to the temple, bringing offerings and prayers, seeking blessings of fertility, success, or healing. The priests told them that to gain the god's favor, they must unite with the goddess's earthly vessel, a living woman chosen to represent divine power. So the act that followed, though deeply physical, was cloaked in spiritual language. The men believed they were coupling with divinity itself, not merely a mortal woman. The temple took the offerings, and the woman was praised as a vessel of holiness. But for many, it was exploitation wrapped in religion. The boundary between devotion and degradation blurred completely. Young girls were sometimes dedicated by their families to the temple from childhood, raised to believe their bodies belonged to the gods. When they came of age, their service began, often against their will. The priests maintained strict control, claiming these acts maintained cosmic balance, ensuring the Nile's floods and the fertility of the land. Refusal was not an option. The gods, they said, would punish those who denied sacred duty. For the men who visited, it was a transaction of faith. They left feeling blessed, purified, and closer to the divine. But for the women, it was a life of quiet suffering beneath the illusion of holiness. Some historians believe these rituals were not limited to commoners. Even royalty participated in fertility ceremonies, where priests or chosen consorts enacted symbolic unions representing the creation of the world. Pharaohs, seen as living gods, were said to mate ritually with priestesses embodying Hathor or Isis, reenacting the divine conception of life itself. To the people, these ceremonies were sacred. To those within them, they could be humiliating performances of power. The temples of Thebes, Memphis, and Dendera were among the most renowned for such practices. In the shadows of massive stone pillars, beneath carvings of gods and goddesses locked in eternal embrace, real women were made to play roles scripted by men in power. The irony was bitter. Egypt worshipped female deities with unmatched reverence, yet its living women were treated as instruments of religious spectacle. Priests controlled every aspect of the ritual. They determined when a woman was ready, who she would serve, and how long her service would last. Some were kept within temple walls their entire lives, forbidden to marry or bear children outside divine service. When their youth faded and their beauty waned, they were often cast aside, their bodies no longer seen as worthy of the gods. The rituals themselves varied in form. Some involved elaborate ceremonies filled with music, incense, and chanting, as participants symbolized union with the divine. Others were far more crude, carried out in private chambers under the watch of temple guards. In both, the woman was believed to channel divine energy through physical connection. But the emotional and psychological toll was immense. For many, the temple became a golden prison, a place where devotion and despair lived side by side. Foreign travelers like the Greek historian Herodotus wrote of such practices with both fascination and disgust. He described how Egyptian women, believing it was sacred duty, offered themselves once in their lifetime at certain temples, often in exchange for coins thrown at their feet by men. Whether this account was exaggerated or not, it revealed how easily spiritual ideals could be twisted into systems of control and exploitation. Over time, as Egypt came under the influence of foreign powers, Persian, Greek, and Roman, These practices evolved or were suppressed, but the traces of them lingered in mythology and art, preserved in carvings that depicted gods engaged in acts of creation, life emerging from passion and chaos. The Egyptians never saw sex as sinful. They saw it as a cosmic act. But when sacred belief becomes institutionalized, when priests hold power over the meaning of the divine, holiness can quickly become a mask for horror. The temples that once echoed with songs of worship also held the silent cries of women who had been told their suffering was sacred. These women, forgotten by history, were the hidden sacrifices of a civilization obsessed with eternity. While the pharaohs built monuments to immortalize their glory, these women's bodies became the unseen foundations of faith, used, praised, and then erased. In the end, the story of Egypt's sacred prostitution is not one of lust, but of power. It shows how easily the human desire for connection with the divine can be corrupted by those who claim to speak for the gods. What began as a celebration of fertility and creation became a ritual of control and exploitation. And though the sands of time have buried their temples, the truth remains written in the silence between the stones. That beneath the grandeur of ancient Egypt, a spirituality lay a darkness as deep as the tombs they built for their kings. Death was sacred in ancient Egypt, but even in death, the human body could not escape desire. The Egyptians believed the soul's journey to the afterlife depended on the careful preservation of the corpse. Embalmers, those who prepared the dead for eternity, held immense responsibility and access to something no one else was allowed to touch: the naked bodies of the dead, often young, beautiful, and of noble blood. But with this access came temptation, and with temptation came one of the most horrific whispers in Egyptian history: acts of necrophilia among the embalmers. The process of mummification was long and complex. Bodies were washed, organs removed, and sacred oils applied to preserve the flesh. The embalmers, working in silence, were expected to maintain purity and respect. But not all did. Ancient accounts suggest that some of these men were unable to resist the allure of beauty that death could not erase. Especially when a young woman of noble birth died, her body would be prepared with exquisite care, her face still radiant, her skin perfumed, her hair combed with oils from faraway lands. For certain men, desire and darkness merged. The act was not one of love, but of domination, an ultimate perversion of control over a body that could no longer say no. Historians like Herodotus, who recorded the customs of Egypt, claimed that to prevent such horrors, families of young or beautiful women delayed delivering the bodies to embalmers until decomposition had begun, ensuring they were no longer objects of lust. The fact that such measures were necessary reveals the magnitude of the problem. It wasn't merely rumor, it was precaution grounded in grim reality. For the embalmers, the line between ritual and violation was perilously thin. They were surrounded by death daily, by silence, by loneliness. In the stillness of their work, perhaps they began to see death not as an ending but as possession, an eternal, unresisting form of beauty. The embalmers lived on the edges of society. They were essential to religion, yet they were feared and despised. People avoided them in public, believing they carried the impurity of death wherever they went. Perhaps this isolation twisted their minds further, pushing some into acts of unthinkable depravity. In their world, every touch was supposed to be sacred, but once reverence faded, corruption followed. The horror of necrophilia in ancient Egypt wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. To violate a body meant to disturb the soul's journey through the duat, the underworld. Egyptians believed that desecrating the dead brought curses not only on the perpetrator, but on their entire family. Yet even divine wrath was not enough to stop the few who acted on their darkest urges. Imagine the scene inside the embalming chambers, torches flickering, the air thick with the scent of resin and myrrh, the body laid upon a stone table wrapped in linen. For most, this was the sacred preparation of a queen, a priestess, or a noblewoman destined for eternal life. But for the corrupted, it became a moment of violation disguised by ritual. The body was already stripped of its name, its voice, its will, and that powerlessness made it the ultimate object of possession. The priests overseeing the process might never know, or perhaps they chose not to see. The act left no mark that could be proven, only whispers among workers and the stench of guilt that lingered in the air. And yet, the Egyptians feared this sin so deeply that they built rules to prevent it. The Book of the Dead emphasized purity during burial rites. High priests were required to cleanse themselves with sacred water and recite protective spells before touching the dead. Still, corruption could not be entirely banished, for even the holiest rituals could hide human weakness. The paradox of ancient Egypt was that it worshipped the dead more than the living. Tombs were more lavish than homes, coffins more decorated than beds, and the journey to the afterlife was considered more important than life itself. Within such a culture, where death was beauty, where the corpse was divine, it was perhaps inevitable that some would cross the line. For them, desire became religion, and sin became ceremony. The embalmers who committed these acts were never honored. Their crimes were buried in secrecy, punished by exile, execution, or worse, erasure from memory. To be forgotten was the ultimate Egyptian punishment, the death of the soul. Yet, their existence left behind a shadow on Egypt's perfection, a reminder that even the most advanced civilization could not purify the darkness within human nature. The same hands that wrapped the pharaoh in linen might also have desecrated a princess. The same mouth that whispered prayers might have spoken unspeakable words over the dead. It is said that the gods watched everything, that nothing escaped the eyes of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification. Perhaps that is why these acts became rare. Because those who dared were believed to be cursed, hunted in their dreams by the very souls they defiled. The Egyptians feared ghosts, spirits who returned to seek vengeance for wrongs done to their bodies. For the embalmers who crossed that line, sleep was never peaceful. In the end, the story of necrophilia in ancient Egypt is not only about perversion but about power, the kind that corrupts when one human being has absolute control over another, even in death. It shows the fragile boundary between devotion and desecration, between reverence and obsession. In a world that worshipped life through death, some lost sight of the sacred entirely. And while the tombs of kings still stand gleaming in the desert sun, the truth about what happened in the darkness beneath them remains a haunting echo, a reminder that not even the gods of Egypt could save mankind from its own desires. Magic was everywhere in ancient Egypt. It flowed through temples, medicine, and even daily life. The Egyptians called it Heka, the divine energy that shaped the universe, the secret force that connected humans to gods. They believed that with the right words, symbols, and rituals, anyone could summon Heka to heal, protect, or create life. But power always has a dark side, and in Egypt, some of the most horrifying acts were committed not for pleasure or greed, but in the name of magic. Fertility and love were obsessions in Egyptian society. The survival of families, dynasties, and even the kingdom depended on the ability to produce heirs. When natural methods failed, people turned to the supernatural. Love spells, fertility charms, and sexual rituals became common among priests, healers, and sorcerers. These acts, often hidden behind the temple walls, blurred the line between faith and abuse. Some believed that to awaken the power of fertility, one had to recreate the divine acts of the gods themselves. In these rituals, men and women were forced to perform sexual acts not out of desire, but to satisfy the conditions of the spell. It was believed that the union of male and female energies could summon the blessings of Hathor or Min, the gods of love and reproduction. But these sacred acts often turned cruel. Victims were told it was their spiritual duty to participate, that refusal would bring curses or infertility upon them and their families. One of the darkest forms of Egyptian magic involved the use of bodily fluids, semen, menstrual blood, and even urine. These were believed to hold powerful connections to life and death. Sorcerers would collect them in jars, mix them with herbs, animal fat, or ashes, and smear them on idols or bodies to invoke desired results. The same hands that healed could also harm. A love spell could easily become a curse, binding the will of another person, forcing them into obsession or madness. There are records of women begging priests to make a man fall in love with them, only for the magic to twist, consuming both in psychological torment. Some magicians were known to use corpses in their spells, particularly those of virgins or unborn children, as they were thought to contain the purest life energy. They would grind bones into powder or use parts of the dead in rituals meant to ensure fertility or sexual vitality. The thought is chilling, but for the Egyptians, it was seen as part of the cycle of life and death, a necessary sacrifice to maintain balance. Even in medicine, sexual magic played a role. Physicians might instruct a barren woman to sleep with a temple priest or perform specific acts while invoking the gods' names. The act itself was seen as medicine, not sin. But the boundary between healing and exploitation was razor thin. Many of these rituals were nothing more than violations justified by superstition, and yet people obeyed, because to defy the temple was to defy the gods. In some love spells preserved on papyrus, the words themselves are shocking. They command the target's body to burn with desire, to never rest until they give themselves to the one performing the ritual. It was control through enchantment, possession through prayer. The Egyptians believed magic could bend the will of gods and humans alike, and so they experimented without restraint. They used animals in sexual symbolism too. Bulls, cats, and snakes were all considered sacred. The bull represented male power, and its semen was often used in fertility charms. In darker rituals, bestiality was hinted at as a way to connect with divine strength. While such practices were rare and condemned by the higher priesthood, whispers of them existed in remote villages and among desperate sorcerers seeking forbidden power. The tragedy was that the victims of these rites, whether human or animal, were told they were serving the gods. They were praised as conduits of creation, not victims of cruelty. The illusion of holiness covered the stench of sin. For the Egyptians, nothing was entirely good or evil. Magic was a tool. It depended on who wielded it. A priest could use it to heal the barren, but a sorcerer could use the same power to destroy a rival's marriage or life. In both cases, sex and fertility were central themes, woven into the rituals like the threads of linen wrapping a mummy. But behind the poetic hymns and glowing torches, fear lingered. What if the gods were watching? What if the rituals meant to please them actually provoked their wrath? Over time, the line between divine magic and forbidden sorcery grew thinner. Even in the late periods of Egyptian history, fertility magic remained common, though the acts became more symbolic than physical. Offerings replaced intercourse, and figurines stood in for human participants. But the echoes of the past remained, the memory of rituals where belief justified brutality. To modern eyes, these practices seem monstrous, yet they were born from desperation and devotion. People wanted love, life, children, and protection from the unknown. And when the gods seemed silent, they turned to those who claimed to know their secrets. The magicians, the healers, the priests, they all played with the invisible fire of faith. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of dualities, life and death, light and darkness, purity and corruption. Its people built monuments to eternity, but practiced rituals that revealed the fragility of human morality. In the name of fertility, they crossed boundaries that even death could not erase. The magic they worshipped was meant to give life, but in their pursuit of power, they often destroyed the very humanity it was supposed to preserve.